As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Well, welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm seated with Tanya and Paul. Now, there's actually a reason I wanted to talk with you two specifically about our topic today, which is the goal of education. Tanya, do you think it would be accurate to say that you're more practical than Paul?
I think if Martin were at this table, I would say that Paul and I are the practical ones. But since Martin's not at this table, I don't know that I'm more practical than Paul. I really do. I mean, Paul is very practical and he does understand how the classroom ought to work and Cheryl's vision and all of that stuff. But he's able to go to a higher level than me philosophically.
Sure.
So that maybe makes him feel less practical. Honestly, we should have this conversation when Martin's here because talk about impractical.
Well, maybe we have it without him.
Maybe we need to have that practical conversation.
Yeah, we'll bring him and do this at some point.
I think Paul could say anything. I think Paul could go anywhere and say anything that would come out of my mouth. Paul, I do think of Paul as being the colleague that is closest to understanding what the classroom ought to be.
Wow. Now, Paul, would you consider yourself practical or philosophical as a thinker? Typically, what is your habit of mind?
I reject your dichotomy.
I love this.
I reject that distinction. Give me the nuance. No, I think what you're getting at, there are people that shine in the practical, and they don't need to get into the weeds of the philosophical to actually do things well. Right? I think I would say that's.
Honestly, I think it's me a lot of the time.
Okay, but. You know, and you have the stereotypical absent-minded professor who's so deep into philosophy they can't remember to put their shirt on, the right way, And so I've never actually seen them put a shirt on the wrong way, but I'm waiting for that day. That'd be wonderful. But I don't think it needs to be either or.
Sure.
I think I think when we educate in the way that we're trying to, I think we are trying to form people that can live in both worlds. And I think that's been the strength of Memoria Press is you had Cheryl who is eminently practical and, but could understand the philosophy, but that she leaned towards how do I do this in a classroom? When rubber meets the road, what does this actually look like? And you had Martin who was thrilled to dig into the philosophy of it and helped inform some of the things we were doing by that philosophy. But we also know that when rubber meets the road, he's going to be further up in the clouds than the actual road.
And Paul could go either way. But I think your follow-up question is going to have to be, because you asked me if I was more practical than Paul, would be to ask Paul if I'm philosophical.
Yeah. Is Tanya more philosophical than you?
I would say no.
Oh, okay.
And I was actually shocked by the hesitation Tanya had when you were like, is Paul more, would you say, practical than you? I thought she would go, absolutely not.
Well, we're obviously using these terms very generally, and we could define them and be more careful. But I think this is a good entree. Is that the right word? A good start into our conversation about the goal of classical education, the goal of education more broadly.
Can I say one more thing about
Let's hear it.
Paul mentioned Cheryl and her vision, and she really did have both. She read a lot of philosophy and really tried to educate herself, but her main goal was to make this education, which can get in the weeds, accessible. And that was the whole purpose of the Memoria Press conference. I remember those first meetings we had when that was her vision, was to have a conference. And she had been to so many different classical education conferences, and they were all up in the clouds. And she said that's not, people need some of that, but what they really need is to know, how do I, on the ground, get this done? How do I teach this and be successful so that our students can truly end up with a classical education? And so that was her driving force, but she really did have both.
Yeah, that's good. So where we're going is the goal of education. But before we get there, I do want to stop to ask you if you've been reading anything else recently. Paul, I know that you've been hunting a lot the last week or two. Do you take a book out with you into the field?
Normally I do. This year we have so many deer that I don't really have a chance to pull out the book. I just kind of sit there and then boom, like 5 minutes later I have something I'm otherwise occupied in. No, I've decided, since I only have these little snippets of time recently, I've picked up short stories again, because that's a good way for me, as we've talked about, that through the summer I have trouble finding time at home to read with the farm. And then as we're kind of getting into winter, but I still have a lot to do outside, and it's wonderful. The weather's gotten colder. We get that fire going in the front room, and then we don't want to leave the front room. And so we just sit there, and what do? We read. And so it's good. But when I know that, okay, I only have a little bit of time, rather than trying to sit down and read a long chapter of whatever it is, I'll sit and read a short story. And so I've picked up Graham Greene. I've got one. I've got a collection of shorts from Honoré de Balzac that I want to get into. But Graham Greene is like, if I ever need a kick in the pants, start reading again.
You really like
Graham Greene. Yeah. So that's what I've been kind of getting back in the habit with. Right. And then, and I have to admit, I still haven't finished Don Quixote.
You haven't?
No, I'll go make a significant section ahead of it, and then
it is a book you can put down.
Yeah, I put down, and then I go back. It's episodic.
It is. Yes.
Yeah.
Tanya, what about you?
I'm currently reading Wendell's new book, Wendell Berry's new book of Port Royal stories about the life of Andy Catlett, and it's called How It Went, which it's the name of a story, and I'm puzzled by the title of the book. I find it really hard to remember, but in true Wendell Berry style, it's very good. And I just finished this really obscure book that I bought at a bookstore in London that was published. It's from 1960, and it's by a lady named Nancy Mitford, who I'd never heard of. And it was a strange little book, but it was beautiful. I bought it because it was published by the bookstore as being like one of their premier publications, that, it's numbered in the front, and it was just pretty. Sometimes you buy books because they're pretty. And I've got to read Orthodoxy, because I thought Lee was going to disown me as a friend and colleague when I admitted to her that I'd never read it. I mean, it never crossed my mind it was a big deal that I hadn't read it. Have you read Orthodoxy?
So I've read chapters from it multiple times. I actually started it last week, and I read the first 3 chapters because I've read selections, but I've never read it front to back. I read Heretics front to back, but never Orthodoxy.
Okay, well, Lee thinks it's just required in the lives of people she knows. So
I guess I need to say sorry, Lee, too.
I need to finish it.
You haven't read it either? Well, we've got to read it.
No.
We have to read it for Lee, because if not, she was just like, what?
I do find even just in those first 3 chapters, he has the bit about the insane man's logic versus the sane person's logic. And I've read that section multiple times. And as I'm reading, I'm like, it's so clever.
Right.
It is actually very engaging, even though he's philosophical. So there's no reason why I haven't read it. I just haven't.
So I find it much easier to read fiction and much more enjoyable. And I've made so much fun of you for reading nonfiction and it being your preference, when really you could turn the tables on me, because every time we talk about this, I'm reading works of fiction that come out first and just struggling to get through nonfiction. So,
well, that's the difference between you and me, is I would never turn the tables on you.
Oh, okay. So maybe you're more classically educated than me, right?
Could be. So I actually am still, the primary book I was going to mention, though, is I'm still working on The Beautiful and the Damned by Fitzgerald. And I had an observation about this book. Have you read that, Paul?
I have not. Now, how thick is this book?
It's not huge.
Okay.
No, I'm reading on audio, so I don't know how many pages, but I'm in book 2 of, I think, 4. But in the beginning of it, there is this description of the main story is about a kind of intellectual who doesn't have a job, living off of his father's estate or grandfather's estate, and then the essence of beauty, this woman he tries to fall in love with. And there's this kind of tumultuous relationship. And it seems to illustrate, maybe better than any other work I've ever read, this kind of parallel spectrums that for girls who are single, there seems to be slightly amused and decimated. And for guys, there's tortured and ambivalent. And this is just illustrating that tortured personality of just the is she, isn't she, in a way that's very amusing and resonates.
I've got to read it because I need to read something else by him instead of just continually saying I don't like Great Gatsby when I haven't even given anything else a shot. That's unfair.
Well, back to the topic at hand. The Memoria Press front page of our website says that the goal of education is to create wisdom and virtue, or to inculcate wisdom and virtue in our students. Paul, what does that mean? Why? How is that actually done in education? What does that look like?
Do you want philosophical Paul or practical Paul?
That's a good question.
All of Paul.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I'm starting philosophical. First of all, I think it's an attempt to express that we want to form the entire human person, not just their academics, right? That's why we talk about wisdom and virtue. And in some ways, when we say wisdom, I feel like this is a half-baked thought, but I feel like it's right. The sort of the end result of a liberal education is one in which somebody is wise, right? They reason well, and they reason from good first principles. And so, but then you have the other part of the human person, which is their action, right? We're not just floating immaterial minds, right? Those are called angels. We're incarnate. We have flesh, right? And so we are making decisions on how we are to act, not fully based on reason, but based on emotion and based on, the circumstances at hand and all of that. And so we also are intending to form that side of the human person so that they know how to think and they have habits of right action. And so that's, I think, the large goal. And obviously in books, we can only do so much of that, of doing both, but that is our intent. And when we are involved in the actual education of a child, say at Highlands, that's where we are, through everything else we're putting into place, a lot of that other stuff is to focus on that virtue, on that character formation, right, on that right action.
Tanya, how would you unpack that phrase if someone asked you, what does it mean that your classical education inculcates wisdom and virtue? How would you unpack that for someone?
Well, I would say the same thing that Paul just said about it, and that it is more, I do think sometimes I've tried to be more aware of this. Sometimes we really do talk about it in terms of what the curriculum is doing for us, which is it's doing a lot. All the famous men stories, all the literature, the children's literature from the very beginning is full of all those lessons in humility and just modeling for students what it means to be courageous and virtuous. And but we really have to take it further than that. Students aren't going to necessarily pick up on those things by themselves. So we've got to be actively involved in their education and in the training that we do with manners and respect and why do we need to respect each other and what does that look like? And so all of that is a part of it. It's not just the curriculum for us. We're a book company, but it really is more also about the pedagogy in the classroom and how we treat each other and how when I'm walking down the hill and I'm on the sidewalk, that the students actively move over and give me space to walk rather than me having to go to the grass because they're coming at me like a herd. Just stuff like that we are constantly working on, and that you have to work on at home too.
Right.
All that, it really is character formation, so that then whatever they do with their lives, whatever vocation, that they do it ethically and morally, and that they do it with gladness in their hearts, and that they do feel like, regardless of what they're doing, that they are fulfilling God's purpose for their lives, which is, that's really what it is equipping them to fulfill God's purpose.
Can I'd like to challenge you a little bit and say,
let's hear it.
A little tiny blurb on the front of a website, it misses some things, right? By design, right? It's just trying to be brief, and
that's what the podcast is for.
And get
that's right.
Right. So
just the conciseness required.
Right. So the one thing that I actually want to point out, I was thinking about this. So the other day, was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday. Or 2 days ago, we had a training with Michelle T. Fertiller. We're doing this, internal, getting everybody up to speed on primary, on what we do in the primary years. And she used, as an example, when we were talking about enrichment, the story of Ferdinand, and then the music piece, which the name's escaping me, but it's from Carmen.
The Toreador song.
Thank you. Yes. And so while she was talking, I just kind of pulled it up on my phone real quick because I was like, I want to listen to this when I'm done. Well, I forgot about it. And the next morning I'm bringing my 4-year-old nephew in for preschool. And generally he asked to listen to Moana or something. And which, they're fine songs, but I thought, let me turn this on. And so I started talking to him about bullfights. And this is kind of this is meant to express that. And I thought he was just going to go, right over his head. And so we're listening to it. We start talking about other things. That song finishes. So I turn off the music because he had started talking, and I figured, well, we'll just talk. And after a few minutes, he says, can we listen to that song again? And I just realized how alongside, I know theoretically, and I've seen it happen in kindergarten classrooms where these kids, they're happy with it, but I didn't expect it to really enter him in those 3 minutes of that song, right? With no other, we hadn't read the story of Ferdinand. I asked him if he'd read it. He didn't know the story.
Oh, you need to read it to
I do
him.
need to read it to him. And yet it really, it hit him at his core, sort of this is beautiful. And so then whatever the playlist was, it continued on, and there was another song that I can't name them, but I recognize them, which sounded more like a horse race, right? And so I just kind of expressed it. This is another song. What does this make you think of, right? But it was all classical music. It was all forming what he sees as good and what he likes. And so as we're talking about virtue formation and knowing how to act, but also it's forming their appetites. It's forming what do they want, so that what they like is automatically edifying to them, which most kids don't get.
Yeah, speaking to that point, in broadening that phrase, inculcate wisdom and virtue, you can unpack wisdom and virtue. You said in your answer, you linked wisdom with thinking rightly and virtue with character formation, but there's a broad history. Even the word virtue is a translation of that Greek word arete, which means excellence more broadly. And so there's no end to kind of exploring that sentence to see the nuances of it and how that actually works its way out in our schools and our classrooms. Now, on the other side of defining it, you could also ask, what would an education that doesn't inculcate wisdom and virtue look like? What are the other goals that people are putting forward and saying, this is what our education should accomplish? This is what it's aimed at. What are some of those aims that maybe are fine, but they're not the best aim for your education?
I think that we've talked about this before. Martin is very opinionated about it. That now education appears to be about vocational training and tracking students very young. Like, you're really good at math, so we're going to put you in a STEM track, and you don't really have to take a lot of English classes anymore. It's just I feel like that's happening a lot in college too. I don't think my son's gen ed classes were as heavily balanced as mine were. I think it was really easy to get, because I was not a STEM person, but I still was forced to take 2 math classes and 2 science classes. And I think he had to take 1 English class maybe. And very quickly he got into the classes for his major, which was psychology. So I feel like he missed quite a bit, but I went to a liberal arts college that had, we had 2 years of forced humanities 5 days a week,
Sure.
which I didn't appreciate at the time and would love to go back and do now. So it was different, but he went to, did he go to a liberal? It's a liberal arts college, supposedly, right?
They call themselves that, yes.
Yeah. So I just think it's changed.
Yeah. Well, I also wanted to say, first of all, I like to ascribe the best of intentions to everybody around me. So I don't know why. When I look at other models of education, and sometimes I think we just don't have a model, right? So some schools, they just don't have a model of education. And what they're thinking is we don't have the time to worry about character formation or anything like that when our reading scores are poor. We need to focus on that, right? Whereas we would say your reading scores can skyrocket when you actually have good behavior, right? You need both, right? But that the goal of that kind of school is purely an academic, getting students comfortable in certain academic spheres, right? Whether it's language communication or mathematics or whatever. And they see that as the only essential thing they need to accomplish. And it's only serving only a part of that person and not the whole of that person, I think. And it's making it so that I think the accomplishment of that has much less meaning for that student.
It sounds like you're kind of saying 2 things there. One, that a lot of times the goals in education aren't malicious. They're just not thought about. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah.
But then second, it also, that leads people to just focus on what's directly in front of their face rather than having a broader vision for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And I think there are, don't get me wrong, I think there are people out there who think deeply about education and decide they want a different goal than what we have.
Sure.
Right. But I think by and large, because we're right probably at the tail end of living off of the fumes of what education was 100 years ago. Right. But nobody's, people are still saying, yeah, we need to learn how to read. Okay. That's a start. Right. But if you're saying we need to teach people how to be good factory workers, well, reading may not actually be the most important thing there. Right. And so I think there's still just, there's still, what's the word I'm going for? It's an impulse, or there's our tradition is still pushing on what's happening.
It's propelling us forward,
but
a
lightly
little bit.
so,
Yeah.
lightly so. And in those people that don't have a clear educational philosophy.
And I think that could be true of any school. I do think you have to make a deliberate effort to think about where your curriculum is going and what your ultimate goal is. And if you haven't done that, and if every teacher is just left to determine his or her own curriculum for that year and nothing ever connects, there's no way it's going to be as good. I personally, as a teacher, would have loved that freedom to be able to choose the books that I love to share with my students, and to be able to spend as much time as I wanted to on literature and maybe not as much on science. But I wasn't allowed to do that. And it was because it wasn't about me. It was about my students and what they needed and where we were going and what they would be expected to do in high school. And so I had really specific things that I had to do in the classroom, specific ways that I had to teach. And looking at it from an overview, it wasn't as enjoyable to teach The Hobbit to me. as it would have been to teach so many other things, but it was necessary for the students. And it's not about me. It's about this ultimate education that is so valuable that we have to do the hard work to make it happen. It's not easy. And I think even though many teachers have a lot more freedom than we have ever had, they are also defeated. They feel defeated because they recognize that it's not working and they're exhausted and burned out. And if they just had, I think everybody needs that goal, that final goal of what are we doing here? What are, that, I hate to say company goal, but really for a school, that's what it is, that vision. I don't think teachers are necessarily given a vision of where we're headed. And I think we struggle with that, educating our teachers to see it goes beyond your individual classroom. Teaching is very isolating. You're in that classroom all day with those students, and you can easily forget that when they leave you, they are going somewhere else, and they need to be prepared. And you can see it in a teacher that's a little less structured. And our primary teachers do such a good job training the students. But if one teacher then lets down that goal and lets things get more loosely structured and is getting less done because of behavior problems, because of that lack of structure and control, then all of that work before is wasted.
Your point about losing vision is really interesting because in some ways, for a school to cast a vision and the vision that we're trying to give to people through inculcating wisdom and virtue really is an act of the imagination. It's saying this possible goal for your students to be wise and virtuous is possible if you pursue it. And a lot of times when we're in schools observing, one of the things I struggle with the most is not necessarily that the things that we would recommend are hard to communicate to someone. Most times it's really that the teacher can't really imagine a world where the things that we're saying could actually happen.
Right.
No, my students just won't do that. And that's just not how they're going to respond. And I don't think reciting at that pace and with that amount of memory is actually possible. And that's the real obstacle, not necessarily the mechanics of doing it.
Right. So we have to cast the vision also, but also, which Cheryl really understood, and now we're coming back full circle, is we have to make it possible. We have to show people that it is possible and show them how to do it. And also that it is baby steps. You're not gonna turn a school around overnight. It's gonna take years to do. The schools that can do it best are the ones that start with a kindergarten, and they have one grade that they need to work with, and they bring those children up all the way and start an additional year every year, an additional grade every year. That's the easy way to do it. But most schools, if they just decide we're going to do it a different way, we're going to instill a classical Christian education in not just the curriculum, but the whole package, then it's going to take several years.
Well, and I mean, I would also say, in like way that in a school, you've got, the administration, the teachers, the students, like everybody's got to get used to whatever that shift's going to be. It's the same way in homeschool, right? Like if you're deciding that you're going to completely shift the way that you've been schooling at home, you've got to do it little by little, because your kids are going to wake up one day and go, wait, what just happened?
That's right.
Right. So you've got to say, okay, this week we're going to do these two things differently, and just slowly.
Or we're going to start Latin this year.
Right.
Not necessarily classical history, but we're going to dip our foot into Latin.
Right. Right.
So let's return to the theoretical for a second. And Paul, one thing I've heard is that some of the shift in education in America came from people who began to view the goal of education as maybe a tool for social change. How would you interact with that, and how has that shifted our attention away from training students towards wisdom and virtue?
I mean, I think you're right that the people have viewed education that way. But really, what we're talking about is if we think that there are good things to be passed down from our forebears, then that's what we should be passing on in education, rather than trying to throw that out the window and say, well, we're going to do it this way and train up the next generation to do that. I mean, really, we just have a fundamental assumption of, is there good stuff in the past? Right. And that, I think, determines how you're going to educate. And so and I think our forebears were wise enough to say, things in our world change. So for us to say, this is the only way to do X, Y, or Z, what that means is, in 100 years, when things have changed, if we're still saying we need to do X, Y, and Z, and we don't know the principles behind that motivated that for us to live by those principles, then we're going to end up with people that can't function. So, so that's why they were focused on the liberal arts. Let's teach you skills. Let's teach you how to reason. Let's teach you what the good fundamental principles are. And then you have to make your own decisions based on where you find yourself. Right. And so, I mean, that's why, and I think I've told this story on the podcast before, when I was reading the Jesuits' Plan of Studies from the 1590s, and they would spend 3 or 4 years just studying Latin for 5 or 6 hours a day, to the point where the kids were fluent in Latin. And then about 7th grade, they'd turn around and they'd do everything in Latin. And I turned to Mrs. Lowe and I said, hey, we should do this. Right. And her response to me made it very clear to me that she was thinking about classical education for the 21st century, where we find ourselves, what are these principles, how do we motivate ourselves to do that? And so, to use the term progressives, right? The progressives are trying to say, we're going to change culture by changing education, right? I think what they're doing is they're denying that we have good things that we want to hold on to. And they're saying, we don't care about reasoning from the first principles. We're trying to say that in this day and age, this is the only way that we can do this thing, right? So they're not trying to teach kids how to think. They're just trying to say, this is what needs to be done, right? Or this is what you need to think about this. Whereas we're sitting here going, well, you just need good basic principles, and you need to know how to think. And then you reason that out, right? That becomes something that then you can stand strong on, and you're not pushed to totally change your belief system based on the winds.
So you're kind of saying, if by societal change we mean human flourishing, then why cut ourselves off from the past in the process?
Yes. But I mean, by societal change, the people pushing for societal change are not pushing for different, they're pushing for very specific changes, right? They're not trying to say, oh, hey, we believe, we were being taught that, I don't know, a point is breathless width, right? Like it's, but we want to completely change the way we see reality, and that's no longer that thing. They're just saying, no, we want to say that 2 + 2 = 5, right? No, it doesn't, right? But if you know what 2 and 2 is, then you know it has to equal 4, right? I don't know if I went from geometry to arithmetic.
You really did.
I'm tracking with you.
But my point being is they're not arguing for different underlying principles. They're just saying, we don't care about what the principles are. This is what we need, right? And this end result. And what we're saying is teach people how to think, and then argue about what your premises are to get to that end result, and then we decide. But that's not something that you shouldn't. I think that is unjust to a student to try to use them to change society. You should be teaching them how to think, and then letting them as adults be a part of that conversation. I think that's
amen, brother. He's preaching.
Yeah, I'm hearing it. Now, Tanya, he's arguing that we should go to root ourselves in the past, not cut ourselves off from the past, in order to, and then implicitly subvert our goals in the process. What about someone who says, but the past has a lot of problems in it. There are a lot of issues. You read me a quote that maybe speaks to this. How do you respond to the person who says, the past, we need to press forward and innovate and create and do new things and try to conquer the frailties of the past?
There's no better way to learn about the mistakes made than the real mistakes that were made in the past by human beings. There is so much. I mean, all the mistakes have been made. If we study the past, then we're going to recognize them and hopefully not repeat them. But if we block all of that out and we've got some kind of utopian past, we're not going to ever learn anything. And then we are likely to repeat mistakes. Can I read my quote?
Please read it.
So this is from an essay that it's a book review is it a book review? Yes, that Tracy Lee Simmons did about Kenneth Clark. Have you watched Kenneth Clark's Civilization films? I had to watch them in college. They are so good. I mean, we should have them. Yeah. I don't know how available they are, but we should have them. But Tracy says about Kenneth Clark, he showed that we have a duty to approach the past sympathetically, not because crime and guilt don't reside there, but because the faculty of understanding is unlikely to kick in if not sparked by humility. What does he mean by that? Not sparked by humility? Not sparked by humility. Yeah. That we are going to be humble if we look back and see all the mistakes that we could easily have made. That other people have already made, but do we need to make them ourselves to learn from them? I hope not.
Well, and I think he's also saying that we can't understand if we're not humble. Right?
That's right.
The very beginning of wisdom comes by first saying, I want to understand. I'm not approaching this from an arrogant perspective. I'm approaching this from, what can I learn from
I only
this?
know that I know nothing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And I think that's so true when we're talking about sort of the goal of education, right? Like, not to be arrogant about our humility, but we're sitting here saying this, we were educating our children for thousands of years. Why cut ourselves off and then say, no, we're going to do something completely new when we can look and say, okay, how did they do it? Let's learn from what they did and what mistakes they made in order to educate our children well, rather than just saying, oh, blank slate, let's go make all those mistakes again.
Okay, here's the other quote you just said that I loved. In an era of cultural strain and educational collapse, what greater service could anybody render than to point out anew what is and has always been worth knowing?
That's us.
Amen.
Well, we're trying from a humble stance.
Yeah. So let's end on this. We've talked a lot about the goal of education and where it can go wrong. For a teacher, an administrator, a homeschool parent that's trying to execute this vision, this goal, what are a couple of tangible steps they could take to consider their goals and to align themselves with a good goal for education, inculcating their students with wisdom and virtue?
I think a good self-exam is a good place to start, and to try to say, like, okay, what are we actually doing? And if an outsider were to look at what we're actually doing, what would they assume our goals are, right? To try to do that on yourself, then you start to go, oh, maybe we as an institution or we as a family, we're saying we're going to do this thing over here. But when you actually look at what we're doing, an outsider would say, well, you're not meeting that, right? Or what you're doing isn't helping that cause. And so then you say, okay, because I think a lot of people do have what they would put up as their goal, right? And so then, okay, now what do I need to change practically to make sure I'm headed towards that goal? I think starting by sort of examining yourself. I mean, we talk about accreditation processes or whatever. You start with study yourself, figure out where you're at, and then let's talk about what we can do to change and make those steps.
And let us help you. I'm not saying we have it all figured out, because we don't, and everybody knows that uses our curriculum, because it does change. It's not stagnant. But the basic foundation is still there, as it has been from the time Cheryl started all of this. And so use what again, go back to the past. Use what we've done. You're not alone. Partner with us and let us help. I do feel like we can provide good help. And so I don't think anybody needs to feel overwhelmed or incapable, because I think we've made it as easy as possible. Go to our website and read some of the articles about classical education and Latin and why. Read Climbing Parnassus by Tracy Lee Simmons. There are or just call us and let us help. Go to our forum, and listen to the wisdom of all of those women and men using our curriculum and the struggles that they've had and the mistakes they've made, and learn from those. It's it's an ongoing process that we're still trying to figure out, but we can at this point offer a lot of help. Nobody needs to feel like they're alone in this.
It's great advice.
And I would say the Sodalitas and teacher training videos from past years.
Yes. Yes. And also, if you can't teach something, if you really feel incapable, I was incapable of teaching upper level science and math. You may feel incapable of teaching writing or incapable of teaching literature. Whatever it is, get help. Use the online academy. Use those master teachers as you can. And, there's just all kinds of help out there now. Educate yourself, which was another podcast.
Absolutely. Well, this is a great conversation. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below. And if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.